When do you breed and calve out your cattle? Well, whenever they come in heat, of course. And that might be the right strategy, but could there be another strategy? Breeding seasons? That's what we're going to talk about in this episode with Dr. Joe Mask. Is it better to breed and calve cattle out all year round, or should we have specific calving seasons? Infinity Cattle Services, owned by Chris Shivers, is glad to be a sponsor of the Cattle Innovation Station podcast. Infinity Cattle Services, a unique, vision-driven, service-oriented company committed to developing successful revenue-producing cattle operations, is a full-service consulting and marketing firm specializing in Brahman and Brahman-influenced cattle. Contact them today to learn more about how they can assist you with locating cattle, cattle mating, sale management, marketing, communications, record keeping, data submission, and a wide array of other services. They can be reached at 713-202-1747. Again, that's 713-202-1747, or at infinitycattleservices@gmail.com. That is infinitycattleservices@gmail.com. Visit their website at infinitycattle.com or check them out on Facebook and Instagram. It's time for another episode of the Cattle Innovation Station podcast, where we keep you current on beef cattle industry events, help you innovate your herd to turn a profit, and help innovate the beef cattle industry so we can feed more people on less land. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Joe Mask. Dr. Mask is a professor of animal breeding and genetics at SFA or Stephen F. Austin State University. He's also been a county extension agent and the executive vice president of two breed associations. So today, Dr. Mask, I'm very curious about the question of breeding, using breeding seasons / calving seasons, or breeding and calving out your cattle all year round. So, what in an operation, what does a breeding season look like? And how is that implemented?
Good question, Baxter. And I'm going to start by saying I don't want to step on anybody's toes here. But I am very pro breeding seasons. I think that leaving bulls out year round could be some issues, and we'll kind of talk through those. But first, if we kind of define breeding seasons and in some of those advantages, some of us have fall breeding herds, some of us have spring breeding herds. Once again, it goes back, in my opinion, to the marketing of your cattle. When do you market your cattle? I think it goes back to your banker. When does that banker want to see return on investment of an operating loan? And so I think that a lot of times our breeding seasons are determined by that, or they're determined by where we're at. Do we have more grass or do we have more forages at certain times of year that makes it easier for us to calve? And so that's when it comes to it. Now, the big advantage, in my opinion, when it comes to a breeding season is we have a uniform calf crop. You can sell your cattle all at one time. You get buyers to come in and, we can sell them on video. We can sell them in a local auction more, but, they're all handled the same. They've had a good vaccination protocols, that you and your veterinarian worked on. They're fed the same. Maybe they're backgrounded for 30 to 45 days. Maybe you also were able to dehorn and castrate all those cattle at the same time, if you're not using polled bulls. And so that uniform calf crop, I think, goes a long way. Then I really think it's kind of what I was saying as well, is the easiness, it's easier, I guess you'd say, to manage those cows. Knowing, what part, a reproductive, life they're in, it's easier to manage those cows when we have, cows that are, all breeding in a 60-day period, but are all calving in a 60, 70-day period. It's easy for us to manage those cows. And then it goes back to that marketing as well. I just think if you can, take a load of calves to the sale or a load of calves to a buyer, all at the same time, and you get a truckload, you're going to get some premium there because I think folks know where those cattle are coming from. Breeding season for me, I like that, 45 to 60 days. Um, some people go 45 to 90, some people stretch it out to 120 days. I think too, it goes back to what technology are you using? If we're using, some of the more improved technologies like IVF and ET, we can have them all, we put them in recips all at day 7, and they're all pretty close. Then we put a bull with them, not quite 18 days later, 11 days later, then all of a sudden all those cows are calving pretty quick. And so, those are those advantages of it, especially having a defined breeding season.
You have said there is a lot I want to unpack for just a
Okay.
second. So on a breeding season, you talked about the different lengths, but you talked about using 2 months instead of compared to 3 months or longer. I think that I would definitely I understand where you're coming from there, and I agree with you because I think that if you do go 3 months or more, you can't really breed a cow in her first month after calving, and so those second or third month would probably be your breeding season, and if you go any longer than that, then you're outside of that 365-day window of having a calf each year, which affects your profitability. My question though is on a breeding season, if you breed a cow in the beginning of the fall, so September, she will have her calf in around June, right? I'm doing my math right, June. So that would be so fall breeding seasons would calve in the summer and spring breeding seasons would calve in the winter. So should you breed in um the winter and summer and calve in the fall and spring, or breed in the fall and spring and calve in the summer and winter?
I think that goes back, Baxter. I think it's a great question. And I think it goes back to, once again, your management style, where you're at, where you're located. You know, me personally, I like to start calving somewhere around the 15th of September. I like those fall calves being born September, October's. And then I like calves being born in March and April. Um, and here's why. Number one, I'm selfish for myself. If I'm pulling a calf in August, it's pretty hot. If I have a dystocia issue or something like that. And then two, I don't want to get out there when it's 32 degrees and try to calve out cows as well. Because, being a producer of mostly American influenced cattle, both indicus type cattle, it's a little bit tougher on some of those babies, in January and February. I'm not saying it's impossible, just saying that, it gets to the point where that's where we like to calve, and that's where our market falls into. People know that we'll have those March, April calves and we'll have, September, October calves. I'm not saying that we won't have some Novembers, and I'm not saying that we won't have some Mays. But that's kind of where we like to fall into play. And then you kind of figure out from that point is when you're going to market those calves. And so if we finish calving in May, we're going to count 6 months later, probably, or 5 months later, and then we're going to start, that's when we're going to sell our calves. So I think that it goes back once again, that management of knowing, what is the lending institution that's holding those operating notes if you got them, when do they want to get paid? And then it's a lot easier for them to know that when you're going to market those calves. And so, I think that it's going to really depend on what you want. I talked to one individual that said that, he likes year-round breeding for one reason, is that he's predominantly self-show heifers. And, when all of his good Octobers are gone, he wants to make sure he's got some, he wants to make sure he's got a really good November, December. Because people, they come in there and they see, all Octobers. Well, everybody's going to compete against everybody in that breed or from him. So he likes to have calves, about every month of the year just to kind of fit, number one, his management style, but his clientele. And so I think that, when we talk reproduction, it's all about that cow. But when we talk about when we do it, I think it's all about us when it comes to management and when it comes to, our opportunity for profit.
Have you been looking for a place to buy top quality AI sire semen or collect a bull of your own? Well, look no further than Elgin Breeding Services. Located in Elgin, Texas, Elgin Breeding Service is not only one of the best breeding services in the business, but also has superior customer service. Contact them at ebsbull@elginbreedingservices.com or by phone at 512-285-2019. Again, that's 512-285-2019. And visit their website at elginbreedingservice.com. Have you been looking for Brahman cattle with a good genetic background? Contact 79 Cattle Company, selling reliable Brahman replacement heifers, Brahman show prospects, and Brahman bulls. Contact Taylor Tate at 210-241-4511. Again, that's 210-241-4511. Or contact Mallory Tate at 210-861-0155, 210-861-0155.
Yes, sir. So that makes a lot of sense. My I guess I have one other question about the breeding seasons. If you're breeding in the summer, how do you mitigate that heat stress problem? And I know you as well as myself, we raise American cattle, but how do you mitigate the heat stress problem that can affect reproduction?
Well, I think you've got to look at shade. You've got to look at something about coolness. I think that's why it's really tough, especially in where we live, is trying to breed those cows or putting embryos in after July 1st. Those July, August ones are even trying to collect bulls for semen. Those animals just don't want to perform in that heat. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying you've got to use some shade. You've got to use some mitigation of that heat. Maybe it's you got some cows up in a barn, or you're trying to, breed one or two show heifers. You got fans on them. You got a portico. You got something to kind of bring that body temperature down that helps you out. But I try not to get in that situation. You go up north and, we're seeing snow in Colorado this week. So, I mean, we're in 1st of May. And so their days are not going to be get as warm they could be. But I think any way that we can mitigate heat, with shelter, shade, fans, that's a way to get some of those cows bred. Now, if we're trying to put bulls out in July and August, it's going to be tough.
Yes, sir. So I said that that was my last question about breeding seasons, but I have a few more. So breeding seasons, we're having our calves either once or twice a year. But with breeding, calving all year round, you're able to increase that cash flow. So whenever you are using breeding seasons, how do you make sure that you can plan ahead? Because we are in a volatile industry where the price of feed can go up, or down, or the price of fertilizer or equipment breaks down, or whatever it is that can affect our input costs. So how do we make sure that we are budgeting for the next 6 months where we're waiting on the calves from the next breeding season to bring in our next source of income, or major source of income?
Baxter, that's the silver bullet question, because things do change and we are in a volatile society, in a volatile industry. I think that we've got to do a lot of planning. And I think that that's where it comes into, that help of, financial people that, help us kind of maintain, our budget. I think that, now that, we're having to increase our budgets yearly because, like you said, fuel, feed, fertilizer, unbelievable cost. I saw an ad this morning about, some cattle that sold, back in, I think it's 1974. There's an ad on Facebook. I've got a good friend of mine, Fred Sheets, shared what these cattle, averaged, and I think it was, the sale was like $1 million sale back in 1974, but at that time a truck cost you $4,000. And so I think that what we're seeing today is, yeah, we see higher cost on the cattle run across the scale, or we're selling bulls at production sales, but we're also seeing increased input costs. I think that's where it goes back to, once again, it goes back to that management side of things. When we look at breeding seasons, we know that we're going to sell calves 2 times a year. Yes, we got a tighter window on our calves. Yes, we've got more labor concentration just in that certain period of time, but then we've got to figure out that how do we manage that money to move through to that next set of calves are sold. And I think that, you mentioned earlier, and, as we were talking about, finding more innovative ways of making money, like semen sales. Maybe it's embryo sales. Maybe it's, we don't have a calf, but we can sell a flush on a cow or an aspiration on a cow at a sale. And I think you did something like that just, a week or so ago, to increase that cash flow. And so I think we've got to get innovative today. I think we've got to get really innovative of how we spend money. We've got to figure out how to make that tractor last a little longer. We got to make sure we, maybe do a little bit more forethought and planning to make things go a little better. Because as we go, that cash flow, those larger unified groups are going to bring us a little bit more premium. So we've got a little bit more in our pocket at a time. It's more predictable. We know we're going to sell calves today in October. We're going to sell calves in June or whatever. But then that sporadic income hurts all of us. And we've got to make sure that we have, I think, in the cattle industry, and I think that, you've had guests on here before that have talked about budgeting and talked about, how do we stretch that dollar, and how do we have, the power, if the market goes low again, how do we maintain, our genetic herd? And I think it's easy sometimes on both sectors, whether you're a cow-calf producer on the commercial side or a seed stock producer, you have got to do something in marketing of your cattle, in the genetic, in the everything we put together in those cattle to make your cattle bring, more money. And so what is it about the cattle that Baxter Whitworth has, or what is it the cattle that, that you produce that makes them more marketable in a downturn, and it makes them more profitable in a downturn? And so I think those are those things that we've got to keep in consideration, especially when it comes to how we put our breeding seasons together.
Yes, sir. And what you just said, putting breeding seasons together, that's my next question. How do you, because this is the question I've had for a long time. If you have cattle that are spread out across different months, but you want to create a breeding season and a calving season, how do you group those cattle into a breeding season without losing the time of the profitability of that heifer or cow getting bred back on time? Or is that even possible?
I would say it's a slow process. It's a process that's got to be thought through. And I think you can bring those cows back around. Now you're gonna take some of those cows that, I'm a big proponent of palpation, that, a cow's not bred, and maybe it's a management decision. You move her from the spring to the fall, or the fall to the spring, and give her another shot. But if you've got a herd that's just, broke out, maybe, you put together a 4-year or 5-year plan of how do we bring those cows back together. We sync them up. And I think that, that's ways that we can bring those herds back together to a defined breeding season, if that's what we want to do. But it's going to take time, and you're going to lose a little bit of profit there, I think, as we're making some of those shifts. But I think take the cows that you can group together and start grouping them together and just start working at it. Um, you know, I see a lot of people, Baxter, that leave bulls out year round, and I'm not against them. I'm not against that factor. I just, I like to have that break just so I know, when cows are bred or because I can plan more of my nutrition management by doing that. But, I know that there's capabilities or some situations that they don't have the capability of doing that. They don't have a place to put a bull, for, 9 months out of the year or whatever. They don't have, cross fences where they can cross fence and put, one set of cows on one place. And so I think it goes back to it goes back to number one. If you haven't done this, and I tell my students this all the time, you've got to write a set of goals. If that goal is not written down, you're never going to reach it. And put that goal somewhere where you can see it every day. And if your goal is to take that year-long breeding season and take it down, then what are the mitigating factors that it's going to take to do that? Come up with a goal and stick with it. And but if we say we're going to do something and we never write it down, it won't happen, I promise you.
EP Cattle Company. Owned by Eddie Wilson, EP Cattle Company is home of Sir Rouse Handshake. Rouse Handshake is a sound-structured, heavy-muscled bull that is really bold-ribbed. So it comes with no surprise that he is a Fort Worth and San Antonio Junior Show Division Champion and Rio Grande Valley Open Show Division Champion. He is a grandson of BRC Noble and JDH Shank Manso, and is also a great-grandson of Mr. H. Elijah Manso. You can contact Eddie Wilson or Nicole Wilson on Facebook at EP Cattle Company. So remember, if you're looking for some well-performing, registered Brahman genetics, contact Eddie Wilson on Facebook.
Are you looking for high-quality hay that is priced well? Then make sure to visit Threadgill Hay Company. They have fertilized horse jigs and Tifton 85. They carry square bales and round bales. Their square bales are $8 a bale, and their 4x6 round bales are $50 per roll. That's a nice price and good quality. They're located outside of Mount Enterprise, Texas, and they will gladly give you more details when you contact them. Speaking of contacting them, you can reach out by texting Sawyer Poole at 903-646-4741 or Ronald Threadgill at 903-235-2011. Yes, sir. Well, I love what you just said about making goals and talking about those factors that play into those goals, or as I like to say, the systems that help us reach those goals. But we have talked about reproduction. We've talked about how it impacts the profitability of your herd, how to make your cattle more reproductive, and other things about reproduction. But we've talked about management, and so one thing about management is reproductive health. What illnesses are there that impact reproductive health? How do we prevent those, and what are the most cost-effective ways to prevent those without breaking the bank?
I'm gonna give you 4 words, Baxter, and then we're gonna talk into it. But I'm gonna tell you the easiest way to do it: good fences and good neighbors. Okay, those are probably. We talk about reproductive diseases. Those are probably the 2 main factors that I look at. But we talk about those diseases, and we could talk about this for 3 days because this is kind of what lights my fire a lot of times is, BVD or lepto or IBR, trichomoniasis, those reproductive diseases that cause abortions, they cause early embryonic death, they cause, open cows, everything under the sun. And we can go in depth in all of them and how contagious they are. But I think it still goes back to, number one, that good fence and a good neighbor. We can prevent a lot of things. The other things that we have to understand when it comes to reproductive diseases is we've got to have a good vaccination program. I can't stress enough how important it is to have that veterinary client-patient relationship, to be able to visit with your veterinarian, come up with a good plan of how do we reduce those factors of reproductive diseases. Number two, we have got to be so careful and strategic when we come up with a biosecurity plan. If you're buying heifers, you bring them on your property, you leave them in a quarantine pen. You buy a new bull, you make sure he's been trick tested. You make sure he's been fertility tested. Yes, I understand it's a law that you have to have non-virgin bulls tested for trick. I'd say test them all. Okay. But that biosecurity plan needs to be enforced. Okay. People coming on your property, people bringing cattle to your property. I consult with a group that had a big scare last year. And I worked with 4 or 5 different veterinarians on this, looking at, because of the reproductive loss and the abortions and early embryonic deaths, trying to figure out, where was the problem. And, it comes back to biosecurity. It's not that I don't like people bringing cattle to my house, but I'm not going to put them by my production herd. I still do a lot of AI for customers when I'm at home. And so, but they're isolated in their own pen. They're not, where they can get around, because we even know like BVD is transmitted by saliva or urine or feces or mother to fetus, And so same thing is these bulls that harbor trichomoniasis in their prepubes, that'll always have it there. And so a biosecurity plan has got to be put together, and I think you've really got to stick with it. Now, talk about the biosecurity plan, the bull testing, making sure, there are so many reputable people out there that lease bulls. I mean, reputable people that I would lease bulls from today. But I think that you've got to still be careful when bringing other bulls on your place to bring your cows. Okay. And I think that's where it comes into that good fences, because you need to make sure that your neighbor's bulls are just taken care of the same way your bulls are, because you're not going to see some of these silent killers, especially when it comes to some of these reproductive issues. You're just going to see over and over open cows and abortions. And then I think it comes back to mineral supplementation. What can we do, on top of that vaccination protocol to make sure that we mitigate the best of our ability in reproductive health?
Yes, sir. Well, I think that's very important because, like we said, health cattle that aren't healthy a lot of times are going to have issues getting bred. They cost us money, and they also aren't making us money. So that's definitely something we have to focus on. But we've talked about a lot of things when it comes to reproduction, but I think here's the culmination of everything we talked about, and that is, when should we cull when should we cull animals in our herd? So the first thing that I want to know is, when do we know that it's not necessarily the animal that we need to cull? When are you the problem and not the animal?
Well, I think, if you're referring to kind of the management side of things, right?
Yes, or not you specifically,
But the management side of a producer.
right.
I think that, when, you have one cow that's had a calf every year, and then all of a sudden, one time you palpate her and she's open. I think we've got to look at that cow. I think we also have to really be very vigilant when we look at if we're using natural service. Did cows not get bred because the bull was down? Did cows not get bred because the bull broke his toe? Did the cows not get bred because, he had a genitalia issue that maybe had some issues there? Is that something that maybe we missed? We didn't understand that, we bought a new bull and maybe he didn't have the libido that we thought he would have, and that he's not getting out and chasing those cows down to get them bred. And so I think that we have to start looking at some of that stuff. Now, if you've got a herd of cows and every one of them's in a body condition score of 6, and you've got one cow that comes in for palpation and she's at a body score of 3.5, okay, where's the problem? Number one, it's management. We should have already brought her up and we should have seen what's going on first. But sometimes we don't do that. And so I think that, as we look at those factors, a lot of times it goes back to just, I always say this, all of us today are addicted to air conditioned vehicles. Sometimes we just need to get back on the horse. We need to get back on the side by side, and we need to drive through those cows. We need to see what's going on during breeding season. We need to see what that bull's doing. But instead, what do? We drive by the fence and we say, well, everything's still alive and there's no buzzards flying, so everything must be good, right? But then we miss those little things. And so I think that sometimes, those are some of the issues when we wouldn't cull a cow is, in those instances. But I think there's a lot more instances, maybe when we should.
Well, this interview is not over, but I sure have learned a lot so far, and I'm sure you have as well. And if you have, Dr. Mash just talked about having good neighbors and how that's important to the reproductive health of your cattle herd. But how about you be a good neighbor and share this episode with somebody else so that they can gain the knowledge that you have as well? And while you're at it, go ahead and rate this episode and this podcast and like this episode if you're watching on YouTube. But we'll get back to the interview. Right. Yes, sir. So let's talk about that. Because, when we're breeding our cattle, we have the bull and we have the cow. But when is it the cow? When do we know that it's the cow's fault that maybe she needs to be culled?
Well, Baxter, I think it goes back to, number one, you've palpated her 2 years in a row and she's up, or you see that she's persistently coming into estrus and maybe, she's one of those cows that just persistently has, an ovary issue or whatever. Maybe there's something that not genetically, but reproductively wrong with her. I think poor mothering ability, those cows that lay down and calf and then they walk off and leave the calf, or you got cows that, starting to udder up, fixing the calf and they've got about as much milk as you could, put in a coffee cup, and never be able to raise a calf. I think cows that have chronic health problems, those cows that are harder doers, I think that, frame score does a lot or has a lot to do with, how those cows perform with what type of forages that we have. And so I think, chronic health issues, are some of those things and those cows just need to go to town. I would tell you that the older I get, Baxter, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said this, but a cow that has a disposition issue now goes to town. Used to, I would deal with disposition issues if she's raising a calf every year. She's a little bad, you got her in the pen twice a year, no big deal, move on. Today it's a little bit different. I think that, age plays a lot of factors into that, is when do you get tired of dealing with that kind of stuff? And so I think that, those kind of issues are reasons really to cull that cow. Bulls, when you got, you go to palpate and you got low conception rates, what's the issue? Core semen test results. I've got some folks that I work with that, do BSEs on their bulls twice a year, once when they pick them up and once when they put them out. And one gentleman has told me that, he does a BSE on those bulls when he picks them up after they've been in the pen for about 30 days or so, 30 to 60 days, just to make sure there's no problems with them and he's not feeding them for, 7 or 8 months. And then all of a sudden he tests them to put them out and something's bad. I'm not saying a bull won't go bad during that time, but I think that we've got to be vigilant about those bulls and we've got to be very vigilant about, doing BSE testing on them, to make sure that those bulls are working to their potential. And then I think that you've got to call those bulls when they have an injury. If there's a structural issue, bulls will get straight or shot in their hocks or start breaking down their pasterns and they can't get up on these cows. I think it's time that we've got to cull some of them. But I will tell you that there's people out there that get a lot of longevity out of bulls because they watch them from the ground up. When they're born, when they're weaning, to their yearlings, to their ring age bulls, and they cull really hard on structure. And so I think all of those things are when we cull those cows. And the other thing I'm going to tell you, Baxter, is that in my experience, don't ever give a cow a name, because once you give a cow a name, it's harder to cull her. If you give her a number, if it's number 2, it's easy to take number 2 and take her to Selborne, but when you have to take Beverly to the Selborne, it's a little harder. And so, we have a deal at our house, which I don't know the names if they had one, because I can't remember names, but I think that's one of those things that it goes back to what you said at the beginning and what your podcast is all about, and it's about profitability. To be profitable, that cow's got to come up with a calf every year. She's got to pay her dues. She's got to be able to afford the country she's on. If not, it's probably time for her to have moves.
Yes, sir. I love that. If they're not, they pay rent, and their rent is a calf every year. So if they're not paying rent, they got to be evicted. But I hope the listeners, I hope y'all have absorbed what Dr. Mask has said, and got to be careful when saying this because don't always want to let it go to his head. But Dr. Mask is a pretty smart man, so hope y'all absorbed what he said.
Well, I appreciate that, Baxter. And one thing I would say is that if we, look at everything that you talked about, and I think, like I said earlier, how you impress me of how you talk to people. But I think when it comes to reproduction, it's a system. Management sets the bar, genetics moves the bar, technology accelerates the progress of the bar, and then the discipline, really drives the profit. And we've got to be disciplined in every decision we make in reproduction.
Yes, sir. I love the talking about the system. I think that's great. Setting systems is how we reach goals. James Clear said that we don't rise to the level of our goals, but we fall to the level of our systems. So I like that. But thank you for joining us, and I hope the listeners have learned something about reproduction. And until next time, keep innovating the cattle industry. Signing off.